Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the Supreme Court's rejection of an eccentric interpretation of the 14th Amendment used to disqualify Trump from the ballot in a couple American jurisdictions. We'll also talk about the retirement of Victoria Nuland, an old hand in U.S. foreign policy and diplomacy. And we'll talk about the buzzy Oscar film American Fiction. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari, Nina Power, and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So this week we got a decision from the Supreme Court 9-0, striking down the disqualifications that had taken Trump off the ballot in Colorado and Maine. Though the decision was 9-0, it revealed certain divisions on the court. The liberal justices criticized the conservative majority that wrote the controlling opinion very strongly, and they suggested their support for an alternate reading of the 14th Amendment's clause regarding the disqualification of officials who had engaged in insurrection. And according to the reading suggested by the liberal justices, it was really an issue of timing and the level at which it was done. They weren't in love with states doing this before the election had happened, but they suggested that they would support attempts to disqualify a candidate after an election had taken place, even after he had been sworn in as president, basically exposing an executive to kind of perpetual disqualification attempts. Obviously, this is being wielded against Trump right now. There's also a growing discourse on the right about Joe Biden talking about his border policy as treasonous and suggesting that he might be guilty of insurrection himself. As specious as these arguments might seem, the step from the disqualification of Trump as an insurrectionist to the disqualification of Biden maybe isn't as big a step as people might assume. Trump's disqualification case really centers on disruption of an official proceeding. Biden has in various ways expressed his support or at least sympathy for efforts to disqualify Trump. What if you view those efforts to disqualify Trump as disruption of an official proceeding, right? Of a United States election. That's an official proceeding, at least by some readings. So should Biden be disqualified from holding office? Should the justices on the Colorado Supreme Court be barred from holding office? Should the Secretary of State in Maine be barred from holding office? Should every Democratic congressman who has expressed support for this, like Jamie Raskin on up, be barred from holding office as an insurrectionist, as someone who has disrupted an official proceeding? I think the Supreme Court tried to move us away from this kind of insane insurrection escalation. Despite the 9-0 ruling, the consensus wasn't exactly rock solid.
Yeah, well, Supreme Court rulings, even when they're per curiam, are never as satisfying and definitive because law has just this kind of indeterminate quality, notwithstanding what originalists especially would insist on. Various terms, as our friend Adrian Vermeule would say, even the kind of terms and parameters of how do you apply black letter law or try to discern the intents of constitutional or legislative framers as soon as you try to do that, you can no longer be an originalist. You're already making various moral, political, implicit judgments. But I didn't mean to get into some discourse about, kind of the nature of American jurisprudence or nature of law generally. As just a side point. The main point is that it's really a moment of reckoning for Democrats, mainly Democrats, that do they want to contest democracy and just try to win by presenting a better vision of where they would take the country. There have been opinion pieces in various places where left of center commentators have said, okay, well, that's over. Now let's try to win the election. I think that's the healthy attitude. That's the right attitude. I don't think that's the Biden administration's attitude, however. At least it's not yet. Because there was an interview in the New Yorker, the senior Biden advisor, I'm talking about Tom Donilon, in which he said, we're going to say that democracy is on the ballot in this 2024 election. In other words, the choice isn't between different visions of where the country should go, which is then open to democratic contestation. But again, this kind of hortatory, vague idea that you either choose democracy or you choose the opposite of democracy, and one choice is democracy, the other is the anti-democracy. And I think that, first of all, just as a strategy for winning the election, that's a really, really bad idea if the Bidenites are going to lean into that stuff, even after this Supreme Court ruling. Why is it a bad idea? Is because most people think, well, I'm going to vote. I am participating in democracy. And if my choice is X or my choice is Y, and I'm playing the game of democracy. So what is your vision? Like, how are you going to make my life better? How are you going to lower prices amid inflation? How are you going to put an end to the chaos at the border? How are you going to deal with the chaos abroad in the Middle East and in Ukraine? I think in some of those cases, the Biden administration has good substantive answers to give. In others, it has to change its game if it wants to make a compelling case. But either way, the point is, like, democracy is not on the ballot. Democracy is the ballot. It's as simple as that. Democracy is not on the ballot. Democracy is the ballot. That process itself is democracy. So let's play that game. That's the game I think most Americans expect to play. And if you make it about these abstractions that satisfy MSNBC talking heads or Atlantic magazine writers, you will definitely satisfy them, but you won't win the election.
I was struck by Atlantic writer Adam Serwer's take on this, which it was somewhat reminiscent of these, Democratic writers around who had spent decades castigating the religious right, but then would castigate the religious right for supporting Trump on the grounds that, well, if you were really a religious conservative, then how could you support this libertine serial adulterer, blah blah blah. And so kind of this attempt to hold them up against their own supposed standards, which was never particularly effective, but allowed for a certain amount of self-satisfaction among these types of writers. But you saw this with originalism around this case because of the peculiar fact that the originators of this interpretation of the 14th Amendment were actually from the right. There are conservative law professors using a sort of originalist textual interpretation. And so you had Serwer basically saying, aha, Alito claims to be an originalist, and yet he doesn't accept this originalist law professor's interpretation of the 14th Amendment. He's not a true originalist, because if he was, then he would clearly have to accept this reasoning. It's a very odd position to take, and it was interesting to see the split among, within liberal punditry about this. But, Serwer seemed to be on the side of people who are, who thought that it was a travesty that the court did not uphold this Colorado barring of Trump from the ballot. And so he wanted to, claim that it was correct or that it would have been correct to uphold this ruling, this reading of the 14th Amendment, even though he also acknowledged that it originated among, practitioners of a legal methodology that he rejects. It's a very odd, it's kind of strange bedfellows situation, which we had from the beginning with this case. Despite it being a 9-0 decision, you did have some kind of accusations of the liberal justices of being traitors and so on, and, not really on our side. So yeah, it was a curious fallout. Even though I think there were quite a few people who, back when we published, Samuel Moyn sort of assailing the Colorado decision from the left, would have been critical of that, but seemed to have come around when the liberal justices joined the majority in this, although they actually wrote a concurring decision rather than joining the majority. But in any case, it was interesting to see how it played out. That there did seem to be some cautious acceptance that, okay, actually this was kind of a crazy idea and probably not a very good one.
Yeah, it really was an idea that had almost no purchase among anyone until this article by a couple of originalist scholars, Michael Stokes Paulson and William Bowdy, apologies if that's a mispronunciation, came out this summer. And, then it really quickly gathered steam, but the idea, and it was kind of laundered through the progressive media complex, but it was a fringe idea. It's now been shot down by the court. That's all to the good. But I think it would be a mistake to think that the lawfare-based effort to deny voters clear and direct choice between the candidates is finished. No less important, in fact, much more important is this civil fraud case against Trump in New York. Trump is charged with what everyone has acknowledged to be a victimless crime. He's accused of exaggerating his net worth and application materials made to financial institution seeking a loan. The financial institution did its own review of his assets, willingly gave him a loan, was satisfied with it, and willing to do further business with him. If people can't offer more optimistic readings of their net worth, it's hard to see creates certain problems. I mean, these things are debatable. And if an institution does its own due diligence and willingly lends to you, it's very hard to see what the problem is. I appreciate the solicitude for our financial institutions shown by New York Attorney General Letitia James. But the effect of this decision really is to bankrupt Trump and to force him to sell some of his properties at fire sale prices. Trump needs money, just as we all do, to make ends meet, and creating this kind of financial headache for him is quite disturbing. It's notable to me that Letitia James has also celebrated yet another suit brought against this kind of Colorado baker, Jack Smith, Masterpiece Cake Shop. I think we've all been kind of vaguely hearing about him for years. There's some baker who's anti-gay or something, and he's always in court. Well, this fellow's an evangelical Christian. People who are aware of that keep coming to him, asking him to create cakes for sex change ceremonies, whatever, a cake with a kind of something obscene on it, at least in his judgment as a devout evangelical Christian, things like this, and he continues to resist it. His business has been grievously wounded by constantly being dragged into court in this way. Letitia James, after the Trump verdict, has been celebrating the kind of renewed legal troubles of Jack Smith. And I think, what she's really articulating is a sense that if you're on the wrong side of certain political divides that we can recognize as real and important, but if you're on the wrong side of those divides, from the progressive perspective, you don't have the same protection of law. You can expect to be just relentlessly targeted. And you have it coming because you're bad, because you're a bigot, because you're a threat to democracy.
Just wanted to add a couple of quick things, one of which is that Trump apparently met with Elon Musk recently, which is quite an interesting detail, particularly with reference to what Matthew was saying about the financial state of Trump's campaign. There aren't any details about this meeting, but obviously if Musk threw his weight behind Trump, even the New York Times are saying this would be a game changer. Obviously it would be, whether that's financially and or publicly in terms of announcing his support. So I just wanted to put that out there. And I was looking at the British press response to Trump recently, and it's quite muted. A lot of the press are talking about his victory over Nikki Haley, which Trump himself didn't seem to really mention in a recent kind of short talk. I'm not sure if the British press have really made up their mind. I think they're probably not keen on Trump running again, even though I think that looks increasingly likely. And again, as I always say, the love of the underdog is only going to grow the more Trump is attacked through these dodgy legal ideas, the more your average person anywhere in the world is going to be on Trump's side, because bureaucracy and power are really anathema to most people, including tax and all of the things that they're trying to get him on, or financial situations. So I think if Trump can run on a restricted immigration platform and cut bureaucracy and re-enchant America, he would have pretty much majority vote from most normal working people.
With the lawfare against Trump has a line he likes to use in the campaign. It's not me they're after, it's you. I'm just standing in the way. I think that instances like the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, but also a kind of broader rhetoric that's become really prominent on the left, lends support to that statement, gives it resonance for a lot of voters. There's a recently published book, White Rural Rage, where a couple of people who, I don't know, maybe they work at a university or a think tank or just kind of random nonprofit devoted to good causes. Who knows? Who cares? But a couple of white guys who presumably aren't rural, and thank goodness for that, have written about how white rural Americans, with their terrible views, skepticism of immigration, their support for Donald Trump, are enemies of democracy. When you define a whole portion of the country with a kind of long-standing and vibrant support for democracy, a really longstanding history of democratic and populist movements. The part of the country that gave rise to people like William Jennings Bryan and countless others. When you define these people as enemies of democracy, that there is something very chilling about that, and it makes it hard to believe that this is just about Trump, just about this one bad man who's just in himself a break from our norms. But if we could clear him from the scene, then everything could return to normal and everything would be fine. Because let's say that Trump could be put in jail or exiled to Elba or whatever Bulwark wants to see happen. What would you do with the millions and millions of Americans who have supported him?
I can't resist, because it is the book of the moment, the book that is talked about relentlessly on cable and in newspapers. I'm sure good for the authors. By the way, Matthew, one of them is a professor, the other is a journalist. Crack duo. But actually, I have to say, there's been a lot of attacks on the book from the left on Twitter, and sort of that's satisfying to see. Not from the MSNBC left, but from smarter people than would appear on MSNBC. There's a deep irony in this, and we have a review coming out, so I won't spoil that. But my own kind of take on this is, if you read Sean Willentz's History of the Rise of American Democracy, which is this magisterial book covering essentially from the founding to the end of the Jacksonian era. He begins with this anecdote about Noah Webster, who was this kind of the last of an old school of Federalist thinker, ideologue, statesman. And he's grumbling essentially about white rural rage, right? That he's worried that, populist uprisings of the backcountry are going to endanger American liberty. These grubby demands of the many who don't understand that older Federalist scheme, the richly propertied should rule, and these others shouldn't have a say. Other segments of society shouldn't have a say, because in the old school Federalist theory, they're not invested in American society because they don't have property. Therefore, they can become the tools of any demagogue. So why should they have votes, and why should they have greater say? So it's a sort of old school kind of aristocratic or semi-aristocratic reaction against the backcountry democracy in the 19th century. What's incredible to me is that segments of the left today basically sound like Noah Webster, circa 1828, sitting around grumbling about the fact that, the unwashed are threatening democracy or threatening liberty by demanding to have their say in how we run our government. I mean, there's this bizarre shift in left discourse represented by books like this. And it's not just them. It's a kind of wider ecosystem of people demonizing rural America. Many of them are essentially Democratic Party operatives, ideologues, thinkers, etc., forgetting the fact that the Democratic Party itself is in large parts a product of rural rage. It's the party of rural rage. But I guess that's how politics works. Over the course of 2 centuries, parties begin to shift completely, and you come to a point where, major organs of a major mass party lose sight completely of their own origins and their own traditions. There's something very tragic about that, because by some tellings, the Democratic Party is the older party. And so for a party that, has such rich traditions, and Matthew alluded to them, all these kind of figures in populist reform, et cetera, to completely disown its own origins in this ahistorical fashion, it is not, in fact, good for democracy. It is a threat to democracy, to use the subtitle of this book, White Rural Rage. I probably will not be reading it, but lots of people I know, including, again, people on to the left of center, say that it enrages them and raises their heart rate as they read it. So I'm not going to subject myself to that.
Well, it's good that you're trying to keep your blood pressure down, Sohrab, because I know that you had to kind of review and think about the career of Victoria Nuland, who just resigned her post at the State Department, long-serving American official, one of our esteemed civil servants. But you seem to have a more critical take on her in your exclusive Substack newsletter. This comes out every Wednesday morning. Just for paid subscribers to our Substack, Sohrab has kind of looser, freer look at the news. And you can subscribe to that at compactmag.substack.com. mag.com. But for those who haven't yet subscribed, give us your take on Nuland's career.
Yeah, well, there's a kind of personal element to this having to do with me and Compact's launch. When Matthew and I launched Compact in March 2022, commissioned a dozen pieces, including by Matthew and myself. And mine was devoted to Victoria Nuland. And so that appeared day one on compactmag.com under the headline, The Return of the Hawks. And, it's now 2 years later. Victoria Nuland has just resigned, and Compact is about to enter its third year in existence. And the point of that piece was, okay, these people like Victoria Nuland, there are many others like her, had just overseen 2 decades of pointless post 9/11 wars. She began her career in the Clinton administration. Then she was in the office of Dick Cheney during the kind of the early phase of the Iraq War. Then she's under the George W. Bush administration. She gets posted to NATO. Under Obama, she gets posted to Europe. Guess which administration she wasn't a part of course, Trump's. And then she returns as Undersecretary of State for political affairs in the Biden administration, and is the Biden administration's point woman on Ukraine. And the point is that, Victoria Nuland, Tory as her friends call her, is just failed up across, both parties, across multiple administrations. None of the projects she has touched have borne fruit for U.S. national interests, for, global peace and stability. Iraq war was a disaster. And then her obsessive drive to, she kind of personally promoted the overthrow of Lukashenko, who was a nasty guy, but he was the elected president of Ukraine in 2013-14. She pushed very hard for that. Remember, she showed up in the Maidan. And then, what did that do? Well, it kind of predictably invited a Russian reaction, which escalated in 2022 in the form of an invasion. And so what has that wrought? First of all, tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops fed into the Russian meat grinder. Ukraine likely to be forced to accept a much worse peace settlement than it would have achieved had they negotiated earlier. We know that the West, especially the Biden administration and Boris Johnson's government in Britain at the time, pushed very hard to forestall that. They just go from sinecure to sinecure, kind of rising up and leaving catastrophe upon catastrophe in their wake. There's never any accountability. So as I say in the Substack, like if there were justice in the world, figures like Victoria Nuland would be dragged before congressional inquiries being like, hey, like what went wrong in Iraq? What lessons did you learn? How should we do things differently? But no, like they kind of made a wreck of the Middle East, a generational wreck of the Middle East, wasted untold numbers of lives and treasure and blood. And then like 6 months later, they're agitating for escalation against the nuclear power. So to me, she very much embodies never learn anything, never be held accountable mode of our foreign policy elites. That said, and on an optimistic note, the smart money about her resignation is that it signals that the Biden administration wants to cut its losses in Ukraine, wants to prepare the ground perhaps for some sort of negotiated settlement or some sort of at least stalemate in which the escalation ladder begins to, in which we climb down the escalation ladder rather than climb up, but we'll see.
Meanwhile, we have in kind of some comments from Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. It seems that he has some views on who the next president of the United States should be. Sohrab, what's his take on that? Who should we be voting for, assuming we're allowed to pick between 2 candidates?
Yeah, he's campaigning quite openly against Trump returning to office. He says the reason Trump is soft on Ukraine is because he hasn't fought him. I have, or that's the I have part is the implicit message. But, okay, like whatever else about the election, I will just say that this turn in the foreign policy establishment writ large against the escalatory model in Ukraine might have one benefit, which is for all of us who are sick of Volodymyr Zelensky's stupid olive drab t-shirts. It may mean that he's just featured less on our television and smartphone screens. I can't be the only one who's tired of Zelensky's t-shirts. And by the way, it's become a style now for various other world leaders to, whenever they want to show that they're like really engaged with an issue, they don't wear suits. They show up in with 5 o'clock shadows and t-shirts. And it's a really deplorable trend in world affairs. And hopefully de-escalation in Ukraine will also put an end to the T-shirt and scruffy face mode of statesmanship.
I mean, say what you will about Biden and Trump, neither of them would ever do that. Those are guys who put on suits to go to work.
By the way, Biden's suits look really good on him. Okay, I will just say this. I don't know what the way he cuts it, it's like these sort of slim, but not like ridiculous slim like young people wear. 80s Reagan administration slim suits, kind of well fitting. Like the Derek suit guy should do a tribute to Biden's menswear.
Yeah, he's like the Twitter guy who occasionally gets in occasionally causes a controversy about clothing. Yeah, no, I mean Biden, he dresses up, he looks snappy. Trump as well obviously has his kind of power suit look. So I'm grateful for that. I think it is just a way of expressing a kind of respect for the office or respect for the people you're representing and working for. And that's why I find the T-shirt thing off-putting.
Let me just say, I doubt that the disappearance of Zelensky from the world stage will end this trend, because there's another major avatar of it who is the subject of my recent reporting, Nayib Bukele, who is a consistent wearer of sort of sort of Silicon Valley tech CEO garb, and is now a model to leaders worldwide. So unfortunately, there's another vector of influence that will continue to impact the style of world leaders, I'm afraid.
I do think this is a Gen X thing, though. Like, it's this fantasy of sticking it to the man while you are the man, right? And I think figures like Mark Zuckerberg are exactly this, this attempt to pretend to be just some coder in their bedroom, and they're not part of the system, even though they literally are the system. And it's Gen X's fault. I'm sorry. I apologize.
I will just because I don't want you to claim Nina, Mark Zuckerberg, these genius of our time for your generation. Mark Zuckerberg is an older millennial, just like I am, and Matthew is, I think.
No, he's not, surely.
He was born in 1984, so
oh my goodness me.
Sorry, you can't claim him. Okay. But maybe Musk. Let's see how old Musk is.
I think Musk is Gen X.
Musk is 71. Does that make him a boomer or Gen X?
Gen X.
Yeah, Musk.
Okay, fine. Okay. You can have Musk, whom I as you know, not a huge fan of anyway.
There's a movie, American Fiction. I think everyone on the podcast has seen it except for me. I haven't. We had a great write-up. It seemed great to me anyway. I haven't watched, so I don't know. At compactmag.com by Alex Perez, titled "The Cynical In-Joke of American Fiction." Perez was, quite critical of the movie, as the title suggests. What did you all make of it? And maybe you can just tell the listeners kind of what it's about, because I certainly don't have any idea.
Okay, maybe I'll go first. I really enjoyed this film. I did appreciate Alex Perez's take for us, though. I thought it was onto something, but nevertheless, I felt more sympathetic. So the story is really about two things. It's about a black middle-class family, but it's also about a black middle-class writer who is sick of being ignored. And so in order to write for a ready-made audience, including the white middle-class women who run publishing, which is undoubtedly true, something that Perez makes a point of in many of his pieces, that he adopts a kind of slangy black gangster voice, and he writes this novel which is filled with kind of violence and slang under a kind of pseudonym, pretends to be a criminal, and the book is predictably a kind of runaway success, and it's all about exposing, I guess, the desires of the audience. But the reason why I think this film is very clever and very worth watching, is very well written. It reminded me of Sideways, actually, in terms of its quite gentle humour, but very kind of intellectual, sort of warmth, actually. It's really a film about a black middle-class family and their lives, and it's very beautifully studied. But even in the trailers, it's pitched as a kind of anti-woke film. right? Which is very interesting. So the audience goes in, if you like, expecting a certain thing, and perhaps is even seduced into attending the film because of this culture war patina. Although the film is based on a novel that came out a long time ago, perhaps in the first culture war, pre-internet. You might remember it, some of you listening. Which wasn't so extreme as the one we have now, maybe in some ways. It was largely restricted to academia. But really, the film is saying to the audience, in many ways, I think, this is the only way we can get you in to watch a film about a black middle-class family. And actually, you are part of the problem. And there's a very beautiful discussion, which is open-ended, as many great films are, which concerns the relationship between authorial intention, the death of the author, the birth of the audience, and what it means to actually give people what it is that they think they want, and what it is that might actually be more useful and more interesting for them. So I think it's actually a very, very clever film, and it works on multiple levels, and I think it's absolutely well worth watching. It's very well acted and directed and written.
Yeah, and I'm just jumping in here. I would say, Alex's piece for us on it is less critical than the title might imply. It's, I think, quite appreciative, but it's partly about the limits of, because I think one of the reactions to this film was, finally we can sort of ridicule the cultural politics of the publishing industry, right? Where you have these people who, basically in thinking that they are being anti-racist and thinking they're taking on all of these elements of white supremacy in their industry are in fact just kind of perpetuating the most ludicrous stereotypes. And so it very, and again, the book that it's based on was published 20 something years ago. So this is an ongoing phenomenon, but, it's about the cultural politics of representation and the way that, authors of certain identities are sort of pigeonholed into writing certain types of books, which is a subject that Alex has written about previously for us. And the way that kind of creates this incentive to play to white audiences or predominantly white audiences, perceptions of what type of experience is normal for a person in that group, which in this case is sort of, a middle-class Black author from a highly educated family is sort of expected, or, can only become successful by writing this sort of poverty porn, this sort of over the top, essentially exploitation literature. And so it's, so the question was sort of, to what extent is this allowing us to transcend this moment of sort of identity politics in literature and culture? And I think Alex's response is sort of that, it in a way kind of probes the limits of to what extent it can go beyond it. And exactly as Nina said, part of the point of it is, well, it still has to kind of play this game of, even if not directly doing the sort of exploitative stereotype pandering that would normally be expected. Instead, it stands at a remove from that, but still plants it in there because that is the way to attract the interest of audiences. So it's sort of about the limitation of that, and then the question of at what point an author can simply ignore all of that anyway and just write the kind of books that the character who's the protagonist of the film wants to write, right? Which are books that and there's a great scene where he goes to a bookstore and finds that his books, most of which are like based on Greek myth and don't really have any particular relation to what people expect of him as a Black author, are placed in the African American Studies section of the bookstore, and so he sort of demands that they move them to literary fiction or whatever, and then is told, well, corporate makes these decisions about how books get categorized. There's nothing we can do about it. So in any case, it's still, and I guess, the other point that I think, Nina pointed to and that Alex points to as well is like, there is this aspect of it that's just kind of telling us about the tribulations of this sort of middle class family and what they're going through. Alex compares this part of the narrative to like this, stories of John Cheever, or they could be linked to like other sort of major figures in American fiction of different sort of identities and backgrounds. So there is that kind of domestic fiction aspect of it, which is, kind of in a way, a completely different track, but it has to be kind of pegged to this. It still has to be pegged to a kind of identity politics pitch, even if it's doing so in a kind of meta, parodic way.
I think Nina and Geoff covered a lot of ground. First of all, there's just unbelievably funny moments, and I was trying to see because how the audience in a Manhattan movie theater would react to it, and I have to say, like, I noticed that as the ridiculous persona Jeffrey Wright character puts on, as he sort of takes it on and does there are ever funnier gags around it, that the audience kind of became more comfortable laughing at what was plainly ridiculous to begin with. But like early on, I found myself like the lone kind of laughing voice, as it were. Yeah. I mean, a lot, I have to say, like, a lot of those scenes were like in the trailer, and much of the rest of the movie was much more, it wasn't like hardy, har funny. It was, as Nina and Geoff has said, in some ways, this very sad, poignant picture of a Black middle class family with a mother going through early stage Alzheimer's, the older brother of the author character having issues around his sexuality. He's was closeted as long as his father was alive, and so on. So it's not really, the two-story thing is real enough, as Nina mentioned. There's the track of him as a kind of literary fake, trying to pander to as much as he can to white women's literary sensibilities. And then there's the other part of the story, which is this very humane portrait of the Black middle class. That said, like, I was dying because he starts writing, he's like, as a joke, starts writing this novel, and he starts by writing my pathology, and then pauses, deletes the TH in pathology and changes it to an F, so it becomes my pathology. Or there's another character, it's like Sitara Gold, I think is the name, is a very successful Black author. She's like educated at Oberlin, and there's a kind of literary festival interview with her, and she sounds as upper class and kind of highbrow as you would expect someone like that. And then she's asked to do a reading, and she immediately switches to this like ridiculous ghetto vernacular, saying things like, instead of saying asks, she says I axed, etc. But it put me in mind of a very recurrent theme in Iranian cinema, actually, which is in an Iranian comedy, actually, sort of modern Iranian comedy. So there was a movie called The Lizard, Marmulak, in Iran, which was massively successful and sort of like banned by the regime, but they allowed it to come out eventually. And it's about like a common criminal who shares a hospital room with a cleric, the source of power in Iranian society. And the two of them change. He basically takes over the cleric's persona. He steals his like turban and outfit and kind of part of his life story, and then goes to a mosque and becomes like the local preacher, but he doesn't even know how to pray. So he has to sort of perform how to be a cleric. But actually, like, the philosophy of life that he offers, like, you be a good person. God accepts all sorts of people, is actually very humane, and he becomes a very popular, preacher. And I saw some parallels in that of like when people are asked to perform something, to what extent they can actually become that thing, to what extent our character here can become like a gangland kind of ghetto figure, and of course there's Close Up, Abbas Kiarostami's movie about a guy who impersonated another Iranian filmmaker, Mohsen Makhmalbaf. In the course of pretending to be something, you're not actually become that. And I think it's actually kind of quite uncanny to the extent to which that kind of identification can happen, as these other Iranian movies suggest. Whereas in American fiction, there's a kind of more skeptical take about that process of identification, because ultimately he comes to revile this character he's created and doesn't know what to do with him at the end. So anyway, I thought it was really good. And just in general, I was struck by the extent to which here's a Hollywood movie released by MGM that just trusts the audience's intelligence, which is a pretty rare thing, and trusts the audience's intelligence and then gets rewarded for it by, relative box office success as well. So that's a hopeful sign for our future.
So with that, thanks to Sohrab, Geoff, and thanks to you listeners, compactmag.com/subscribe to read more on Victoria Nuland from Sohrab and to catch Nina's weekly Friday newsletter summarizing the news and kind of win some personal terms. Go to compactmag.substack.com.